web of conspiracy. Here is your host, Adam Webb.
Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Web of Conspiracy. I am your host, Adam Webb. Coming to you all a day early. This is not my original plan. This was not my original intent, but the events of the day, I felt like I needed to do a special show dedicated to, I think, what are two significant events, two events that we need to have an open forum about here in the United States for a number of reasons, and I'll certainly get into that as we go on. Nevertheless, the news today, of course, being the shooting down of the civilian jetliner, the Malaysian Airlines flight, MH17. I know there's been a number of jokes, some in poor taste about this. Nevertheless, look, if you have ever seriously considered flying Malaysian Airlines, you may want to reconsider. It is perhaps either the most unluckiest airline to fly, or it is the most targeted. Either way, I would highly recommend that we don't fly that for a while, which is unfortunate for those people who do work at that airline. I don't foresee a very good outcome for that particular airline going forward. Also in the news, of course, the offensive launched by Israeli forces into Gaza. Two big stories, and look, straight up, this isn't going to be a whole lot about the supernatural, the paranormal. That's not what this show is going to be about today. I realize that a lot of you look forward to that. I had intended on doing a show Friday about Bohemian Grove. Perhaps I'm sort of going to slightly touch on something to that effect, but by all means, this is, in my opinion, takes precedence, and this will be the show for the week. Those of you who've listened to the show, you know a little bit about what I do when I'm not doing the show. I work in public policy. I have a chance to talk about a number of issues, both internal but also external. I work to brainstorm ways in which we can build our society back, re-engage our society, as well as working for ways to encourage other nations to adopt more democratic forms and more democratic ways of governance. That is what I do when I don't do this. So that being said, the events that have been going on, for those who've been listening for a while, know that I've been talking about the situation in Ukraine. I've been warning about that situation. And I think that we're on the precipice of a real international crisis there. Certainly we have been for a number of years in Israel and Gaza between the Israeli state, the Palestinian state. That's a huge problem that I don't believe that there is really any real solution to. Nevertheless, I'll get into that as the show progresses, but I really wanted to start off with this situation in the Ukraine. Now, it has been confirmed that, in fact, the flight was, in fact, shot down by a surface-to-air missile over eastern Ukraine, not too far from the Russian border, and that is somewhat significant. Nevertheless, of course, the Ukrainian government claims that they're not responsible, that, in fact, the pro-Russian separatists are the ones who shot down this plane. It would seem that all indicators are pointing to them being perhaps the most likely of suspects. Now, there are also those who claim that perhaps Russia may have shot down, although very few. And there's also reports and people, and particularly interesting coming from Russia, there is a report that's been surfacing and floating around out there that, well, that was actually intended for Vladimir Putin's plane as he was arriving back from the BRICS summit in Brazil. This BRICS summit is a summit involving Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. These emerging economies, and so they have this little summit and get-together in Brazil this year in terms of forming and creating an economic coalition, something that the European Union and the United States should keep a very close eye on nevertheless. They claim that Vladimir Putin was the target. However, other subsequent reports have fortunately said, hey, okay, this is a little exaggerated. Nevertheless, look, this show today, I'm doing this live. I rarely do show live, but I've got the chat function up. I will be looking. If you have any questions, comments, anything you want to contribute, an opinion about any of this, I would love to get your feedback. Just shoot me a little message on the chat, and I'll interact with you as best as I can. Let me advance this a little bit further. Coincidentally enough, yesterday, there were increased sanctions being announced that increased sanctions would be levied against Russia for their lack of initiative in trying to forge a true peace, an effort to try to squelch some of the concerns and the issues and the violence going on in the Ukraine. So many people have said, okay, look, you've had your time, you've had plenty of time, nothing's happening. So the United States, the EU have decided that it's time to step up the pressure a little bit. So on the heels of this, we have this unfortunate jet that gets shot down. Now, what I'm going to present to you, look, there's going to be some speculation here, and I will make sure I'm very clear in defining what it is that I'm speculating, so that you do not confuse fact from speculation. There's still a lot of information that needs to be gathered. There's a lot of information in a number of ways that needs to be gathered here in the situation in the Ukraine before anything is definitive. However, I have a number of opinions about this, as I've expressed some in the past, and I will do so going forward. To me, I look at this situation, and I think that the biggest concern that we have, now keep in mind, and I'm very clear with this, what I'm about to tell you is speculation on my part, a speculation based on a certain knowledge set that I have. I cannot confirm this, and it's still way too early definitively. That being said, I believe that, look, we have an international situation that's now erupting into Ukraine. You have civilians from multiple countries that have been shot down by a military force in the Ukraine. Now, this has happened before. This has happened before. But we're talking about a situation where the international community has been very careful and cautious in how involved they would get in the Ukraine. I believe that is no longer going to be the case. I believe that this will be a trigger to force an international response in the Ukraine. I have seen some commentary out there referring to this as, is this the new version of the Lusitania? That was the sinking of the Lusitania, which brought the United States supposedly into the war in World War I. For those of you who've listened to past shows know that I argue that was really just a PR stunt. We had well enough knowledge in advance that putting a ship there would have caused that disaster. That in fact it was the financial titans that had millions on the line that would lose everything had the Allies not won, that forced the United States involvement. That being said, do I think that this will be the thing that perhaps kicks in a United States response as well as an international response? Absolutely. Unconfirmed as of right now, 23 Americans on that flight have died. I believe 154 Dutch have died. And then, of course, I know there were some numbers from the UK. And then just, of course, there's a few that, there's, I think, maybe close to 20 that are still unidentified in terms of who they are, where they're from, or anything. So this will be a process. But nevertheless, the question that we look at here is the technology used, the weapons used. Now, I'm not an expert by any means. However, the knowledge that I do have, I can tell you that this Buick's defense system, this is not something that a rinky-dink army is going to get their hands on. very easily. Not unless you've either taken it from another force or it was provided to you by another force. So the question that we have to ask ourselves with regards to how did these separatists, in my view, I would look at them now as being terrorists. Of course, you could argue that statement, and I'd be more than willing to listen. Nevertheless, I'm labeling them as terrorists. How do these separatists, these terrorists, obtain this technology? Did they get it? Did they take it from the Ukrainian forces? Well, that's a possibility. And I have not heard or received any reports confirming that definitively. There is another concern here, and that is the location in terms of how close this is to the Russian border, the documented supplying of these separatists by Russian military and Russian forces, the crossing of the borders in this area by the Russian military. You begin to ask yourself, was this a Ukrainian weapon that was taken by the separatists, or was this a weapon provided by the Russians? And if that is the case, then Russia is culpable for what has happened here, and not just the separatists. Vladimir Putin is responsible if, in fact, this defense system was provided by Russian forces, which I believe is the case. Once again, at this point, no definitive proof. And if I'm wrong, next week I'll be more than willing to come back on the show and admit that I'm wrong. But I believe that this is Russian-provided technology. Vladimir Putin, in case anybody was uncertain, I'm not a fan. I have not been a fan of his for quite some time. He is working desperately to bring back Russia. Desperately to create the Novorussiya, the new Russia, the stronger Russia, the greater Russia. Okay? Learning from the mistakes of the Soviet Union. Hybridizing a system that uses some democratic reforms, certainly economic reforms, however, still maintaining a fairly tight fist in terms of some other freedoms and liberties, trying to walk a careful balancing act here. And I'm going to be among the first to throw this out here. And I'm not sure if any others have come out and said this. If they have, well, then I guess I'm not the first. I guess I'm just jumping on the bandwagon without knowing. But in case anybody hasn't noticed, this is the beginning of at least a new Cold War. And we may be on the verge of full-scale conflict in this region soon. The international community, if in fact this is Russian supplied, the international community is going to have to place ultimatums on Russia, draw a line in the sand, and stand by it. The United States can't do it alone. No one country can do this alone. The international community is going to have to hold Russia accountable for their part in this, if in fact they're responsible. Which, in my opinion, supporting these separatists to the degree in which they have, there's a culpability in that. Nevertheless, here we are. And for anybody who remembers, who listens to my show, who remembers life before the 1980s, certainly into the peak of the Cold War, you'll know that I'm right. You'll know that this is what this is beginning to feel like. We're playing a game of cat and mouse with Russia over Ukraine. It's certainly a smaller scale. But that's how these things build. One brick at a time. That's how the Berlin Wall was built. One brick at a time. I'm not suggesting that we're looking at a full mass communist explosion again. I don't believe that's going to be the case. But what I do know is that we are in a tense situation with Russia already over the handling and the mishandling of the situation in Ukraine. This has complicated things tenfold. President Obama is going to be forced to have to play hardball at some point. At this point, he's been very careful, very guarded. I believe the international community has been very careful and very guarded in terms of holding Russia accountable for this mess that they're helping stir the pot of. Nevertheless, here we are. Where do we go from here? What's the next step? Well, I believe, as I said, the international community has to force Russia to make a definitive stand that they will not interfere, that they will stay out of the Ukraine. That's key. Number two, the international community has to hold Russia accountable for that. And that's where things could get tricky. And number three, the international community is going to have to put forces on the ground in the Ukraine. All I'm gonna say is this. If it's that easy for a separatist group, a terrorist group, to get their hands on a weapon like that, how comfortable do any of you feel flying internationally going forward? I'm going to guess that many aren't going to feel very comfortable. I certainly wouldn't. This is creating a hostile environment, if there ever was one, right? And the Malaysian Airlines, if they don't go bankrupt within a year, it'd be a miracle. I don't know how, from a public relations standpoint, this airline is going to survive this and the missing MH370. I don't think it's possible. And now you begin to wonder, well, maybe there is something more to this story with that particular flight. Is this just coincidence? Was it specifically targeted? By all accounts, from what I'm gathered from Ukrainian intelligence forces, that it appears that they really weren't sure, these terrorists, these separatists, what it was, what they were shooting down. They weren't sure at first whether or not it was military or civilian. So if that's the case, I don't think it was in particularly targeted. But nevertheless, I don't know how that airline's going to survive this. I have absolutely no clue how they can weather this PR nightmare. Last week I spoke at length, feeling disheartened at some of the situations that I've been involved with and trying to work in, trying to create, and the irony in all of this. And to give you a little bit of insight into specifically what I've been doing has been working on how do we build peaceful societies, right? What do we do? What is needed to create a more peaceful world? And of course, I have a number of policies, a number of ideas, a number of things that the most peaceful places on the planet do implement. But how do we make this work in places like this? And usually mediation, the United Nations gets involved, but even then it's not always enough, as we certainly see in Israel. This incident cannot be let go of, in my opinion. And it shouldn't be just let go of. A number of people lost their lives today, almost 300, because a group of 4 men, because it takes 4 men to operate that defense system, decided that was close enough to looking like a military jet that they weren't going to take any chances. They were just going to shoot the damn thing down. And that's the world we live in now, right? I mean, this is the world we've lived in for a number of years. This isn't anything new. Just now the technology is a little more destructive. I didn't do a whole lot last week in terms of the news because I was suffering from a little bit of fatigue, a little bit of frustration in it, and sometimes I do. I read this and I read these kinds of things. I see these reports. I watch it on the news. I see the images. It's disheartening. It's disheartening that we have survived all of these, however many years you believe we've been here. If it's millions, if it's thousands, whatever. We've survived all of this despite ourselves. It's a miracle. It's an absolute miracle. We've done everything in our power to destroy ourselves, and we haven't yet. It's amazing. I don't know how much longer we're going to be able to hold that up. It's this adage of having things turn out for the good despite the fact you've made all the wrong decisions. And I'm not saying that mankind has made every single wrong decision possible, but there's certainly, looking back over the last 150 years, and you have to wonder, for all the good that there's been a number of ridiculously poor choices that have led us down paths that we're still trying to figure out how to solve some problems. And that leads me to the crisis in Israel. Now, I've debated going into a long, drawn-out history lesson of what's happening between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I'm not going to do that. I urge you that if you don't know the historical foundations as to what's happening there, please research it. It's out there. It's online. There's plenty there. There's plenty of reliable sources. Make the effort to understand what's happening there. There's a number of causes for this. There's religious connotations. There's land concerns, obviously. There's resource concerns. There's all these different concerns. And it's all been festering since 1947. And there are a number of people who are either very anti-Palestinian, very anti-Arab, and of course then you've got the very anti-Zionists, you've got the anti-Semites who just hate. The hatred amongst intellectuals that study this, it's tremendous how much hatred this has created. Unlike anything on this planet. And that's why there is no sustainable peace in Israel, and there will not be. You had people who wanted to return to their homeland after suffering numerous religious persecutions, only to be persecuted more, to be driven back by forces because they deemed that they didn't have any rights to those lands. And then when they fight back, they decide that not only are they going to take back what was given to them in 1947, but then they're going to take more to prove a point, to demonstrate their strength. As far as I'm concerned, both the Israelis and the Palestinians are equally culpable in the mess that has unfolded over the last 70 years. Almost 70 years now. It's a nightmare. And I cannot imagine being a Palestinian born in the West Bank or Gaza, or for that matter, an Israeli living. I can't imagine being either. Who wants to live in a place like this? I realize that the religious importance of Jerusalem, of these sites, it's huge. Between the Christians, the Muslims, the Jews, all these holy lands, I understand that. But at some point, something is going to have to give. I mean, today, Israel, the military launched a ground operation into Gaza. Now, let me be clear, I'm not a particular fan as to how either has handled this, but I do not blame Israel for launching this offensive. Days of rocket fire by Hamas has led to this. I understand. I hate the fact that innocent people are being murdered. Children are being murdered in this, both Palestinian and Israeli. It's disturbing. Unfortunately, this is the way of life there. And that's the problem. That is the fundamental problem in Israel and Palestine, is that this has become a way of life. It's easier to just manage the violence rather than take true measures to create a lasting peace. The closest that ever happened was in the mid-90s, and all of those gains are gone now. Things are right back to where they were. There is no possibility, in my opinion, that there will ever be a true solution here. There are a number of people who propose, well, one side just gets destroyed and then the winner takes all. That's not an ideal way to deal with the situation. There's the idea of one side becoming the majority. In this case, it would be the Arab nations, the Arabs taking control, and the Jews becoming the minority. And of course, the persecution in response that they would receive would be pretty high given what they have done in occupying Gaza and the West Bank. And then, of course, the idea of they're the separate states as it's been now, but that hasn't obviously worked. The idea of a shared state. I don't know that that'll work. But this much I can tell you is that with Hamas in control of Palestine, there will not be a true peace. It's impossible. It's impossible. First off, Israel will not back down to Hamas under any circumstances. They are a terrorist organization, and as a result, they will be treated that way, not only by Israel, but by the international community. There will not be true international support for Palestine with Hamas in control. However, from the Palestinian perspective, Hamas, they're heroes. They're patriots. They're willing to die for their people. They're willing to die for their lands. While some people may take offense to me saying that, that is how the Palestinians view Hamas. They see them as hope. They see them as, you know what? We may not win, but we're going to die trying. And when you feel like you have been living a prisoner in the West, as a prisoner in the West Bank or in Gaza under Israel occupation, you could see perhaps why people would think that way. Now let me be very clear here, because I'm expecting a degree of backlash with this, to be sure. I am not a fan of what either side has done here. What I really want to see is a true international response, but that won't happen. There needs to be a true mediation. And sacrifices need to be made by both if there's going to be peace. Will any of that happen? No. I don't believe that there can be true peace in Israel. I don't believe it's possible. Not with the strong current of anti-Semitism there, not with terrorist organizations in control, not with a number of different reasons. Of course, you have Israelis, squatting and taking land that's not theirs in Gaza because it's cheaper. It's a mess. This whole thing is a mess. Israel never stopped the Israelis from doing that, even though it was a violation of international law. They were never stopped. Both sides have, on numerous occasions, violated international law in this conflict. It's easier to just manage the violence, work out short-term truces, and just do your best to try to avoid a large-scale issue, which, here we are today, this is where we're at. We got 18,000 reservists being called up by the Israeli military. This is where we're at. We have an international crisis in the Ukraine, and we're on the brink of a full-out war in Israel. the world is teetering. Now, I don't want to sound like a doomsday prophet. I don't want to sound like some crazy fundamentalist that's saying that the world's ending tomorrow. The world could end tomorrow. I don't know. It could. I don't necessarily think it will. But we have some serious problems that require a lot of work and a lot of effort. I don't know that there's a resolution in Israel, but I do believe that there is a resolution possible in the Ukraine. And the sooner the international community gets involved, the better. Now, let me be clear to those in the United States. I'm saying international community. I don't believe this should be on the United States solely. Team America World Police kind of needs to back down a little bit. We have a number of issues that we need to focus on here, and any type of international situation that occurs, we really need to have the support of other nations. We can't be the only ones doing this. That being said, I don't believe that military intervention is necessarily the key either. I think that there can be efforts made to prevent this. That being said, if the separatists in the Ukraine are not willing to meet with the Ukrainian government and not willing to negotiate, then there is no peaceful solution available in the Ukraine either. The key going forward is, what will Russia do? Will Russia respond to international pressure and finally put an end to their supporting of the separatist movement? Or will they continue to feed it? If, in fact, Putin and the Russians supplied these defense systems to the separatists, they should be held fully accountable for the loss of those lives today. It sickens me at the thought that that is more than likely the case. And I hope that I am wrong. I hope that this was Ukrainian technology that the separatists seized. That's my hope. Nevertheless, there's a culpability by Putin, and there's a culpability in Russia in this mess. And the international community needs to be holding Russia and Putin accountable. I'm not one to squelch a country's desires to grow stronger, to be prosperous. Nothing wrong in that. There's plenty of room for prosperous nations all around the world. There does not necessarily have to be haves and have-nots when it comes to nation building. This is a new world we live in, and it's an international world. It's a world of which borders are becoming much more permeable. People are moving between places. We have the ability to communicate with people around the world at any given time, and do so visually, seeing them. The technologies have allowed us so many freedoms. I'm able to work with people in Washington, D.C. from my little cubby hole in the middle of nowhere, Ohio. I'm reaching thousands of people with this show all over the world. From my little tiny hole in the middle of nowhere in Ohio. So yes, the world has changed. We are connected. And we need to find ways to create solutions for the entire world. And everybody can be prosperous. But when you begin to encroach on the sovereignty of other peoples and outwardly support a separatist movement, that's a problem. It'd be no different than Canadians supporting Montanans who are wanting to separate from the United States, or Mexicans supporting Texans who want to separate from the United States. We would not tolerate that kind of support from our neighbors. So, where are we at today? What has this showed us? What kind of inspirational message can I come away leaving everybody? I don't know. I don't know what it is. I don't know if there is one. I do know that we have to stop the division. At some point, we have to be able to look at each other and be able to see that we're all in this together. We may be on different land masses and different parts of this planet, but we are all on the same planet. And whatever it is that we're doing here, we're all doing this together. And we can either make this as difficult as possible by creating a world in which there's a tremendous amount of violence and unrest and divisions over land and resources, or we can find a way to work together and rebuild and focus on creating ways in which we can effectively deal with these problems without creating a have-not. That is the only true solution. And I think it's possible. But we have to start changing the way that we think. I'm not saying that we have to stop viewing ourselves as Americans or as Canadians or as Germans or as English or as British or as Australian or New Zealand. Okay, I'm not suggesting that. What I am suggesting is that we have to stop focusing so much on one particular part of the world, and we have to be able to look at ourselves in the whole, because that's where we're moving. And if anything, if what we saw in the financial crisis of several years back now, it's that when there's a financial crisis in one part of the world, it affects every part of the world. If that isn't illuminating enough into just how much we're in this together, I don't know what is. Unfortunately, there's no good way to point that out to the Israelis and the Palestinians. And there's no good way to point that out to the separatists and the Ukrainian government. Everybody wants their agenda, whatever it may be. So maybe we need to find a way to refocus our agendas. That's, I think, is our only hope for any kind of true peace. Well, that's what I have for everybody tonight. I realize once again, I apologize for those who are looking for a conspiracy or a supernatural type of thing. Bear with me. Next week I'll be back and make sure I bring something sufficiently on the unknown or the unexplained or the conspiracy realm back to the show. So bear with me, and thank you for indulging this particular special edition of the Web of Conspiracy. If you haven't, check out the Facebook page, Twitter, Google+, also the website. And the show is available via Stitcher, as well as I have a YouTube channel dedicated, as well as all of you who listen to me on Spreaker itself. Thank you to all who continue to support the show. It is greatly appreciated. Big month so far, looking like it'll probably be the biggest month I've had all year. So, tremendous. And once again, thank you for continuing to support and listen to me. Once again, I will be back next Friday with a brand new edition and to get back into maybe a little focus on some of the other stuff. So once again, thank you for tuning into this very special live edition of the Web of Conspiracy. It will be available later to download on podcast as well. Once again, thank you, and have a great night.